No, I have not had anyone sign up ahead of time. I do see one attendee. So if anyone attending would like to provide a comment, please raise your Zoom hand. If not, I think we can keep moving forward.
Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
December, yeah, quiet December. I'm sure folks are probably out and about. I'll keep reminding those of us who might remember this, but we used to meet at the Heathman for our December meeting, and it was a lovely chance to see everyone, break bread, so to speak, and talk about things that are somewhat related to forest, but mostly forest adjacent. That was a back in the day. Maybe that can be resurrected again some point where we can meet together and share space in not necessarily a virtual setting. So with that, let me just go ahead and turn it over to Jen to start with the Urban Foresters report. A lot of stuff on the docket, no doubt, as usual. Jen?
Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. If that changes at any point, please raise your hand or something. Okay.
At any point, please raise your hand or something. Okay.
Jen, you have an echo.
That's
maybe we all do.
I don't know what to do about that. Let's see.
Ivory, would you mind muting? Yeah, I
How's
think it
that?
should be fixed now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay. I have, time provided, 8 items to report on, share with you today. The first, right after last month's meeting, I emailed you with information about Portland's government structure change, specifically that City Council had passed an emergency ordinance creating a 15-member advisory committee for the transition to the new form of government, which will take place in about 2 years. That emergency ordinance didn't include information on committee memberships or the process to create the committee. And a reminder that emergency ordinances don't follow the public hearing and second reading process that regular ordinances do. And so I shared that with you because as the advisory body to the city on policies affecting trees, that committee may be a role of interest for an Urban Forestry Commission member to participate in. And I'll put links in the chat for the ordinance and the transition information for you. You also have it in that email. Moving to another item, tree planting is underway since a few weeks ago. And while there are regular reports to the public and the commission on planting in general, in the interest of sharing some of what we've been working on and bring a little bit of equity, inclusion, and diversity content to commission meetings, I'll share that this season, Urban Forestry staff continue to train contractors to help build their capacity and skill in tree planting and establishment. And that includes offering trainings in Spanish from contractors' preference and understanding. As you all, I think, know by now, planting and establishment are early stages of the urban tree life cycle that are critical to achieving urban forest coverage and tree health and stability, longevity, and resilience. And that training helps improve overall forest outcomes and promote professional arboricultural skills for the contractors' work, whether it's with urban forestry or with others. And it's one of the ways that we're promoting workforce development in arboriculture. Third item is an update on PCEF, the Portland Clean Energy Fund. As a result of recently approved code amendments, PCEF is developing a 5-year climate investment plan, which is to guide strategic funding investments to achieve major carbon reduction in ways that benefit those most impacted by the climate crisis. While the CIP is in development, City Council directed PCEF to launch 2 strategic programs immediately. One of those is growing an equitable tree canopy to support the city's 2035 tree canopy cover goals. And there's $40 million allocated for over 5 years of use there. And the other of the two strategic programs is raising the bar on efficiency and renewable energy upgrades in both new and redeveloped regulated affordable multi-housing units. And there's $60 million for that over 5 years. Those two programs were selected based on timeliness, need, community impact, and greenhouse gas savings opportunities. Because the programs are intended to launch in spring 2023, right around the corner, public engagement is on a faster track and stakeholder engagement has already begun. Opportunities for public comment on these programs will be available early next year, which is also right around the corner. As of mid-November, PSEF and urban forestry staff have had several early conversations to develop a shared understanding of our tree canopy needs. Concurrently, we've set some early meetings with community stakeholders in preparation for broader community engagement that's set to occur early in the new year. And the initial meetings and conversations will inform the development of the equitable tree canopy program. And we all appreciate the commitment to investing in our tree canopy equitably and are eager to collaborate with the PSEF program and community partners in service to all of our tree canopy goals. And we'll be bringing regular updates to the Urban Forestry Commission. However, for folks interested in engaging, there is a place to sign up for email updates from PSEF. I'll also put that in the chat for you. Now I have a few policy project updates. Streets 2035, which is now called Streets PDX. That project is moving forward in its final stages now. And you may recall this is more or less the master planning project for street design in the city of Portland that's led by the Bureau of Transportation. Currently, Urban Forestry and other bureaus' technical advisory staff are reviewing draft materials for a public website, a tree checklist, and a tool to assess right-of-way infrastructure trade-offs. Bureau of Transportation is being invited to bring an update and opportunity for advice to the Forestry Commission in the coming months. So you can look for that in the near future. Moving to another policy item, the trees in the curb zone pilot project that you've heard about before. I'll update you on that. The Bureau of Transportation will be working with Urban Forestry to refine designs over the next few months. And we hope to have designs final and be finished with initial outreach to community members by August of the new year, August 2023. And the project manager from the Bureau of Transportation plans to come to a commission meeting for an update and discussion also in the near future. And another one, there are two new policy projects involving trees that could come to the Forestry Commission. The first of those, Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, is leading review of Title 33 land division processes, and Urban Forestry is engaged in that project on behalf of trees. The project may be an opportunity to improve tree preservation requirements and alignment with Title 11, the tree code. It's currently in preliminary stages, and if you are interested, we can put that as an agenda item in the future. And the Bureau of Transportation is developing standards for electrical vehicle charging stations. Urban Forestry is also engaged in that project. Most of the EV charging stations will be on utility poles. Some will be standalone with conduits through right-of-way. This is also in very early stages and could be an Urban Forestry Commission agenda item in the future if you all would like. And then the last couple of things, Urban Forestry staff facilities are currently being reviewed for updating, as are many of Parks staff workspaces. Parks plans for many years have included replacing the house and the trailer at Urban Forestry East Delta Park, where most of our staff work, with one building that has appropriate space. That's resurfacing now due to increased staff capacity, thanks to the parks levy and the declining condition of the trailer, which we have a whole lot of people working out of. The trailer is a temporary construction site trailer that's intended to last 10 to 15 years. It's now over 20 years in use and has extensive issues, including rot. So we're working with parks to try to identify funding to address those things. And lastly, Parks is actively exploring potential funding options for street tree maintenance. As discussed in previous commission meetings, this is part of the Sustainable Future Initiative in Parks. And this topic's also planned for future Forestry Commission agendas. So more to come on that. I forgot to mention this too. The approval of new commissioners for the Forestry Commission is still underway. It's progressing as planned, and we hope to see that come to City Council within the next 2 months. If you have any questions, I'll do what I can to answer them. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Be opportunistic on this. Bruce, see your hand up.
I attended the, the open house thing for the PSEF fund last night. And there was an announcement about some sort of smaller group that was going to be chosen by, I think, January 6th, that relates to tree funding. I wondered if you knew anything about that. It wasn't clear to me exactly. It'll be on their website this Friday, I believe, the app, and it sounds like it's an application, and it's for a short-term commitment. I think no more than a month or two. Do you know anything about that, Jen?
I don't, Bruce. I'm sure
Okay.
we'll know soon.
Okay, all right.
Roberta.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That's good. Also on PSEF, I was just wondering where the Urban Forestry Commission's role is in the developing the strategic program on the tree stuff. Like, is there a role, or will there be inquiries and briefings and opportunity to discuss that with PSEF staff? Or are there other avenues for that?
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. So as I said, there is a plan to continue to update the commission on the PSEF work. The work right now is being undertaken directly with community groups and is in its really early stages for that.
So I'm just thinking that, it's kind of it's very relevant to the work that the commission does and is advisor to the council and to you guys. And it seems like it would seem appropriate to have a role for the Urban Forestry Commission in developing this program, not just being briefed on it, but actually having input into it.
Okay, thanks for the comment.
Is that something that we should forward to the PSEF staff, or is that something, I mean, I get that they're working with community groups, and I think that's great. And they're also working with city staff and others, but this is sort of very relevant to the point, to the assignment of the commission as well. And it seems like there should be a link there. And I'm curious how you think that could be moved forward some.
Yep, sure. We can discuss that with the PSEF staff. We haven't really gotten to that point with them, but we can bring that up with them and see how that might work. Thanks for mentioning it.
Okay, thanks.
I see a question in the chat also from Vivek. How does the PSEF funding, which has an element of street tree maintenance, combine the same aim of the Sustainable Future Program? So the Sustainable Future Program is trying to identify sustainable funding, so ongoing funding for street tree maintenance, so that policy might be changed. The PSEF funding is 5 years of limited funding, at least at present. And there may be street tree elements in that, but thus far, what those might be have yet to be determined, and I think will be driven in part by what community partners would like to see done with that money. So there may be an overlap or some connection. At present, though, they're viewed a little bit differently because the one funding source, PSEF, is limited, and Sustainable Future is looking for something that is going to be a continuing funding source ongoing for street tree maintenance.
Oh, I didn't realize PSEF was limited. I thought that I guess it's a chunk of money over the next, what is it, 5-10 years?
It's $40 million that's been allocated by council over 5 years
Okay.
for urban forestry and trees, and community
Got it.
forestry.
Thanks, that's helpful. Megan?
Jen, and maybe you can speak to this. Isn't there also, I'm real tired, y'all, so my brain could be crossing some wires, but isn't there also the green infrastructure? I don't remember the other possible CIP, but isn't there also going to be green infrastructure, something money? This came up at the Budget Advisory Committee that there was other funding that could potentially be used in PSF that hasn't best tracked in the same way that could be used for street tree maintenance. Like this was a question that came up. Am I talking out of turn, or does that sound like it might be right? Anybody?
I am not familiar with that, Megan,
Okay.
and I wasn't able to be at the BAC meeting last time, as you may have noticed. Brian was there for us. I don't
Yeah.
know if, Brian, you know anything about that?
I have heard that discussed within the context of PSEF, but I think that will be part of they are developing a climate investment plan, and they're establishing a process, and so I imagine that could be tied to that. They've sort of identified tree planting as sort of like a fast track, and so that's why that process is moving forward a little more quickly. But there's a lot more work that's going to be part of this climate investment plan that they're going to be doing over the next few months as well. So I imagine that could be part of it. I have heard that term of this sort of green infrastructure funding bank, but I'm not sure exactly if they've really developed the specifics around that yet.
Daniel, just before I call on you, just a quick update. I know that there are 2 bills that are going to be dropped at state legislature around green infrastructure. If that's maybe what you're talking about, I know Denbro has a bill going in for working lands and carbon sequestration, mostly rural stuff, it seems like. And then Confam's Rep Fam has a bill looking at much more urban green infrastructure that's going to happen. We'll see if they pass or not, but that's allocating resources at the state level anyway. I don't know if that was related, but to your question, Megan, but just wanted to offer that as observations that I've picked up on in the last week. Daniel? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, okay. Thanks, Vivek. Jen, I'm just wondering, in these discussions and conversations with PSEF, has anyone talked at all about making PSEF the long-term funding source, like longer than 5 years, like permanent funding source for street tree maintenance? And the reason I ask that is it occurs to me that when it comes to street tree maintenance, there's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? In other words, there's this idea that we have to find a permanent funding source before the city will be willing to make a code change that makes the city, rather than the adjacent property owner, responsible for doing the work. But until that code change is made, you're not going to really get a lot of people willing to go into it if they know they have the financial responsibility. So you do have kind of a chicken and an egg. And it seems like there's a great opportunity here for the city to at least say, until we can find another funding source, we're going to make PSEF that source, and we're going to make the code change, because we really do need to get this canopy growing. And if we wait until we find a funding source, that could be 10 years. I mean, who knows? I'm just wondering if this has been part of the conversation at all.
It has been mentioned along with many, many other possible things. There's pretty much unlimited opportunity to improve on canopy in a variety of different ways. It is early days for the tree components of the ordinance that was just passed 2 months ago. So that discussion might continue, Daniel. It is important to remember that the intent of PSEF was really to be community driven. So what the community groups are interested in doing, who will be applying to use the PSEF money, is a prime driver as well. So long story short, it has been brought up. It's at this point, there's a lot of different things being discussed, and it hasn't been identified for that specific use alone.
Right, yeah, and I 100% behind having the community be a real driver here. And if you look back at the original ordinance that the voters passed, that was a big part of it. But when this news kind of broke a few months ago that PSEP had so much money, just so incredible amounts of money, that there was no way that community groups could spend it all. And that's part of the driver behind what's going on now with the changes that have been made with the ordinance. It seems to me like there's an opportunity here to actually not wait until who knows when to get the long-term funding lined up, when meanwhile our city is, especially our underserved neighborhoods are suffering from heat island effects, and we have the opportunity to start growing the canopy because the money's there.
Thanks, Daniel.
Well, thanks everyone. Jen, just a quick question. Have you heard anything from Metro about the regional tree policies that they're thinking about? Lynn, I heard from Lynn Peterson, chair of Metro Council, about possibility of a regional. It may affect Washington County and places that have like no set ordinances altogether or any kind of management plans in place. But is that ringing a bell for you at all?
It isn't, Vivek. It sounds like a great idea, an interesting idea. So maybe you could mention to Lynn that we'd be happy to chat with her about it. There may be other folks on my team that have heard about it and I just haven't yet. But as far as I know, we haven't been contacted about that, and it would be appropriate to give us a shout. So
Okay.
Thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, and there's been no local share of Portland with the bond measure. I'm on the bond advisory committee with Metro too, and it's like there's a lot of talk about local share and about kind of local municipalities putting in then bond money being used to be able to purchase lands. And I've been really advocating for purchasing lands in places like what Daniel's getting at, in places that have been historically disinvested in, marginalized, and trying to think about micro parks and small little spaces of green there. And it's not how Metro is operated for, since the first bond measure, and they bought large plots of land all over the region. And I've been trying to say, hey, there's a lot of value in these smaller patches of land where you can have not only high density going in, but also places where people could access green space adjacent to those places where high density and street trees as well as yard trees are not a possibility. So far they don't seem at all interested. So I'm curious, there's no local share for Portland on that right now, is there? Especially as more funds are available.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, Vivek. I can ask around though. I will.
Okay.
Maybe you could do the same, encourage them to reach out to us if we haven't heard.
No, I've bent your ear on that a few times, so keep bringing that up. Anybody else? All right, well, good. We're actually a little bit early. Well, first time where we're preparing for the director of BPS, Bureau of Planning Sustainability, and Andrea Jacob, who's the climate policy and program manager, coming in to talk about the climate emergency work plan, which I know the policy committee, namely Daniel and Roberta and Daniel, put together a letter, which was in the material that Brian sent out. It identifies a number of places where the climate emergency could really align better with some of the interests we have on the commission. So I encourage you, in the time that before Donnie and Andrea show up, to do a review of that if you haven't already, and if you have, review it again, because this is the kind of conversation that I think we're going to really have an opportunity to contribute to. It's rare to have director of BPS come in. I haven't seen the director of BPS ever come into a commission meeting in my 8 years. So it's quite an opportunity to have direct access and involvement with the way the climate emergency work plan is developing. And based on a lot of conversations we've had in the commission, this may be a good chance for us to have some input and craft the direction that it goes. So encourage you to take a look in the few minutes that we have. on the work plan. And there's also statement of work that's on the website. So if you would just take a few minutes in the time we have before Donnie and Andrea show up. We rarely have this kind of chance. Usually it's real time, go, go, go. But I'm going to be quiet for a minute and have you have a chance to look at it. Any thoughts, questions, comments about the letter submitted to BPS or other things related to our conversation with them, with the imminent conversation here? Adrian, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I thought the letter was really excellent. So thanks to those who really worked on it. Yeah, and looking at the plan, I'm wondering if anyone knows if there's actually sort of a real plan behind what's more like a public communication level plan that we're looking at, that we've had an opportunity to see.
I think what you see is what you get. That
Mhm.
you're looking at, unless I know otherwise, the Portland Climate Emergency Work Plan, the one that starts the 2022 to 2025. I think that's Exhibit A. It
Yeah.
looks very.
Done. Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
Most of it is a matrix with specific action items related to rationale and then resources and then fiscal year.
And I guess that's what we'll find out today is,
Yeah.
What specifics will they be doing to get something more actionable?
Yeah, and I will thank Roberta and for the drafting this up as part of the policy committee conversation, and then Daniel and others in the policy committee who contributed to it. So it's really a lot of thanks to the policy committee for assembling this and making such a clear and I think compelling request to revise the revise the work plan to include some very important aspects that are, yes, about trees, but I think also well beyond that as well. Curious, Roberta, is there anything you want to add to this since you were such a significant contributor to this letter?
I'm curious about, I'm kind of curious about the intent of this visit from the EPS director and staff. I was glad, I think we got some traction with the commissioner's office, Commissioner Rubio's office, and she asked them to follow up. She or her staff potentially asked them to follow up with us. I'm grateful for that. And I see Andrea's joining on right now, so that's good. And kind of see how some of the points that we made are what their take is on that and how we can move that forward. So.
All right, welcome, Andrea. Good to see you. And I see Donnie has arrived as well. Hello, Donnie, hope you can hear me. Welcome, good to see you. We were just talking about, we're just talking about the plan and the letter and looking forward to your, really grateful, first off, for your coming to commission meeting. We haven't had directors show up from BPS to commission meeting, at least in the last near decade I've been on the commission. And again, my name is Vivek Chandas, he, him, his, and I have the privilege of chairing the commission until February 2023. And we're all really looking forward to learning a bit more about the work plan, the climate emergency work plan, and trying to get a sense for intentions for coming in today to speak with us, as well as if you have a presentation or if you have other kind of general comments you want to provide. I know we have a letter we've submitted as commissioners to you. Policy committee, subcommittee of our commission was largely responsible for that. And I want to just open up the floor to you, maybe start introductions, and then we can kind of go from there. How does that sound?
Sounds perfect. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry to break the 10-year streak of no directors joining.
We welcome it. Thank you. Means a lot.
So thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. My name is Donnie Oliveira. You see him pronouns. I'm the director here at BPS. And my colleague, Andrea Jacob, is here this morning as well. We do have a presentation, and I would love to get into that, but I wanted to start by just sort of kind of paint a picture for you all with words. about how we got to the climate emergency work plan and why it is the way it is and what's in there, what's not, and sort of the origin story, if you will. So if you just allow me to do that, we'll start there. And then Andrea will go through some of the nuts and bolts of the work plan. And what we do want to dive into your letter and show how we will be responsive to some of the ideas and concepts that were shared with that. So we'll do that too. So then we can obviously Q&A if there's time. Does that sound okay? All right, so I want to take us all the way back, way back to 2019. Seems like almost like a whole nother lifetime pre-pandemic. But the city of Portland, led by BPS, had started a process to create a climate emergency declaration. And we actually had a version. It was done in like July, August of 2019. And very quickly, we got some very clear feedback from our community partners that was unacceptable because we sort of had done it in-house. It was mostly created by bureaus, city staff, technical experts, some of the, legitimately some of the most renowned in our field around the country on climate work, and it was not enough, and we heard loud and clear. So at the time we were, BPS was in the mayor's portfolio, and so with mayor staff, BPS staff went out and recreated a climate emergency declaration that came to council in July of 2020. And it was made up of a lot of, with input from our community partners, and there was over 50 organizations and over 100 people, community leaders that participated in that process to come up with a declaration that was passed in July of 20. And as a part of that declaration, there was a requirement that every year BPS, as the steward of the city's climate work, would come back and kind of give an update on the status of the implementation. We did one in July of 21, that update, but we very quickly realized that the declaration was very aspirational in its tone. There was a lot of high value statements about what a future state of Portland would look like, how we would address the climate crisis with a just transition, being centered in our communities and being racially, with racial justice lens and being thoughtful about past harms. All very important stuff that we all believe in, the core values for the city, and especially for BPS, we take that into our work. But it was sort of lacking some of like, okay, what does that look like to deliver on those aspirational targets and goals? And so, so I'm going to pause there for a second to say also simultaneously, in a very bureaucratic moment, we recognize that our 2015 climate action plan had sunset in 2020. So it was a 5-year plan. We wrote a final report on the 2020 final year. And so we were kind of in limbo. There's some reasons why having an active climate action plan for the city of Portland is important, for some national, international reporting structures that we're part of. There's some requirements within our city code to have a climate action plan. The Clean Energy Fund is required to be balanced off of our climate action plan. So we very quickly needed to scale up a climate action plan. We also had this need to sort of ground the climate emergency declaration into something tangible to work off of. And so the result was the work that Andrea Jacob led to pull city staff together, bureaus, to say, okay, what are the priorities that we know of in the next 3 years to advance the climate emergency declaration work? Like, what are we already aware of in our current strategic plans, work plans for bureaus? What are commitments that we've already made? And we really drilled down to the 43 actions that are in the work plan that are clearly defined in other places in the city already that we're working on over the next 3 years. So in essence, we came up with a short-term climate emergency strategy document that was very clear that these were city responsibilities, right? So I want to be really frank that if you look at the 43, these are things that the city of Portland, capital C, have jurisdiction over unequivocally. Some of them are going to be pushing other institutions, but at the end of the day, these are things the city will be judged on for passing or failure in terms of our success. Whether the runway is 3 years or 10 years or 20 years to implementation, there's so much work, as you all know, that is going to be needed across jurisdictions, regionally, nationally, internationally, individually, by people, both private sector and our individual residents, to tackle the climate crisis. But these 43 actions are really about what Portland can do. And so in doing that, of course, there were things that we know of that we're working on that weren't included. For example, even smaller things and significant things like our city's own fleet transitioning over to renewable diesel, electrifying, that's big work. We barely even acknowledge that in the plan, even though it's already happening, because we were trying to focus on what's next. And in doing so, we totally appreciate that there was details that were left out. And mainly, we want to acknowledge that there is a lot of the how we're going to do some of those things that was intentionally not included, mainly because we have work to do with our community partners to recognize the process in which some of those objectives are going to be achieved. And that's a long-winded way of me saying that we knew going into that to the summer's adoption that this document was going to be a signal to the market and to our partners what we were doing, but may leave people a little unsatisfied with the level of detail. And in some ways, that's got to be okay for us because we have work to do on the implementation front going forward. And I really just want to acknowledge that the low-hanging fruit is gone. If you looked at the 43 actions, if we didn't do another action plan for the next 5 to 10 years, we would still have plenty on our plate as a city to deliver on the things we've already committed to. And I think at this point, the just transition moment is real. Our need to adapt our systems, both buildings and natural resources, obviously our urban canopy is very clearly understood. How we go about it, how we finance that, where's the political will coming from, the community will, those are the parts that we have to work on. And the last thing I want to acknowledge, because this has come up a couple of times, I just want to name this. Simultaneously, BPS, the city of Portland, is working with the county to do the next iteration of a climate plan that's based in community process. We've been working on it for a year. It'll be probably another year or two before it gets done, but we're still doing that work to really ensure that we're still capturing community priorities and clear vision for how some of that more technical work gets achieved. And so we are still committed to that process, and we see those as additive, not replacing the 3-year plan, because most likely the next iteration of the City of Portland Climate Action Plan, whatever it looks like, will still say very similar things: decarbonizing our grid, getting fossil fuels out of our systems, building more resilient and adaptive systems, both buildings and infrastructure and land use and people systems. All those are still very real. Not going to change unless there's a magical technology that shows up that saves the day, which I'm not counting on at this point. So with that, I'm going to just pause because I just kind of ranted for a minute there. Thanks for your patience with that. But we just want to acknowledge that, yeah, there was, we could have spent a lot more time doing more planning, but we felt like there was enough to share in July that signaled what we were going to be focused on for the next 3 years, even if the end outcomes were still a couple of decades out. And I'll stop there. Any questions about that before we have Andrea kick off the presentation part?
Adrian?
Thank you. It's excellent. And, it's wonderful that we're doing this and, 43 action items have been identified. It sounds like a large part of your work was gathering what was being done by many different agencies and folks and so forth. And so during that, did you also gather the specific details of what they were doing and what the specific improvement goals were and who was responsible, et cetera, et cetera?
In some, great question. In some cases, the projects were in motion already. So I'll use a BPS one that's in the work plan. We're focused on building performance. So we've been BPS staff for at least 2 years now, have been working with community groups, building owners to develop a new, essentially building performance policy that would go into effect and would sort of send a signal to the marketplace. Like, this is what we expect buildings, how we expect buildings to perform in terms of energy use, clean air, displacement. That's a process that's been in place for a couple of years. Simultaneously, BPS is working on a plan for electrifying our grid. And although the policy work has been in play for several years, the truth is the actual work will probably begin in 23 about what that actually looks like. So each of those items is at various stages of development. So they weren't all apples to apples in terms of where they're at in the process, that they would have things like timelines, resource evaluation, key stakeholders that'll be participating, even how we would do the work. So that's the range of considerations. And that's why it was not an apples to apples process to evaluate all the items equally. We tried our best to say like which bureaus were in charge, what sort of the identified resource gaps were, what we thought the timeline was for starting the project. But some of these things are so significant in scale that, frankly, one of the questions that I was frequently getting when we met with council offices, like, what's the price tag on this? And if you really think about it in terms of public investment, private investment, things like changing behavior, I mean, we're talking, in the billions of dollars, to be frank. And so we sort of did a a cheeky thing is we put in the work plan dollar figures for like what the city costs to kind of get these projects going. Those dollars, although we try to be as close to reality as possible, they treat them more like the spicy pepper that you see on menus that show how like the spiciness level of a dish is. We're just trying to send a signal like these are costly things we're going to be tackling, not just to do the policy work, to start the work, implementations, thinking about retrofitting our entire, building stock, like, in the orders of hundreds of millions of dollars, billions, our electric grid. I mean, these are the scale of these things are so significant that to spend the time figuring out resources, we'd be spending for years. Let's just start the process of understanding the actual gaps, and so we can signal to the marketplace what we're talking about.
Roberta?
Yeah, thanks for coming, Donnie and Andrea. Maybe Andrea is going to address this, which is great. But one of the things we pointed out is that you're continuing to work on updating the climate action plan. But in 2014, there was a lot of work done by BPS and other bureaus on the climate preparation strategy and the vulnerability assessment that was adopted by the county and the city. And, while the work plan focuses on some on resilience, it doesn't go to the level and the extent of kind of direction that had. And so some of us were surprised that wasn't referred to at all. And so I'm hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about the role of that plan and that direction and where that is going, either being brought into this work plan, over time, or how it's going to be addressed in the future.
Robert, I really appreciate bringing that up. It has been a conversation now for a while that also centers around our form of government, like the structure, not necessarily what we did with charter reform, but literally the bureau structures and how significant some of the responsibilities and of infrastructure that are required by the city to manage are not well coordinated amongst bureaus. So as we were evaluating how we tell that story, we could have been, this is an example of wanting to be very clear and transparent about what we knew we could absolutely say in July, when there were plenty of things in the 2014 report that frankly, we're still working amongst bureaus about figuring out how to own, staff, prioritize. And that is going to be solved over the next few years as we change our structure and we start working with amongst bureaus to sort of silo bust and think about things more holistically. We're trying to set a table for resilience strategy amongst bureaus. We have an existing group of staff that's sort of just been kind of keeping, the water simmering as far as we're thinking about coordination around resilience and adaptation, but not to the scale that we need. So it was absolutely something that we were aware of. How we introduced it without just doing a box check and saying, oh, yep, this plan's here, we haven't forgotten about it, would have felt disingenuous. So we're hoping that once we have a better structure within our system, and we talk about literally the city of Portland's governance, we'll be able to more authentically address how we're going to achieve some of those strategies that the report outlined in 2014, because they're still absolutely salient. There's nothing's changed. The need's still there. In fact, we actually have real evidence in our systems that our infrastructure is not designed for the worst forms of the climate crisis. I think that's pretty evident at this point. So now it's all right, Portland, let's get it together. Let's start activating on some of these things. And again, that still doesn't solve for how we're going to pay for it, and the political will and community comfort with changes that are necessary.
Right. Thanks, Roberta and Donnie. Megan?
Yeah, and thank you to both of you for being here. And this might maybe get addressed during Andrea, but I will always take every opportunity to say that a missing action is the maintenance of street trees in our city. I feel like if we have a climate action plan, there has to be an actionable item about the city. And Donnie, you're talking about what's going to fund it, but finding the funding to take over street tree maintenance. I think if we're applying an equity lens to anything, right, one of the biggest reasons that we don't see trees go in, right, is that their maintenance right now is on adjacent property owners. And so I just think, all the research is out there that, large trees do more than the little guys, right? The little guys haven't gotten there yet. And so I just have to highlight that if I have an opportunity that we have to see the city taking over street tree maintenance. It has to be part of a climate, resiliency plan. We have to find the funding and make it happen. So it's not really a question, it's just a passion to find how we're going to do it and to have more advocates for it.
Thanks, Megan. I appreciate that. And I can't tell you how many things that we were confronted with in this process that were like that. Like, these are obviously needs. Like, I don't think anybody's questioning how essential our urban canopy is, especially street trees. But like we're talking about with our PSEF work, it's like, what is the ongoing maintenance cost? Who's covering that? Do we have a tax base that's willing to start paying more for that? I mean, our general fund isn't going to be able to capture the need. So that question applied to almost everything that's in the list. Was very real. There were things that were really clear. We have 43 actions. There was probably another 43 of equal like weight and like need that we chose not to include, mainly because the questions were even more unsolved. We felt like the 43 things, we could give more authentic answers to how we thought we were going to get there, both policy and through financing. But there were still, several dozen more that was like, wow, another lift. And that was the thing. I said this at council, and it's kind of funny coming from the planning bureau director, but we were trying to get out of the swirl of just planning and start to get an implementation. And I'll just tell you all, to be as frank as possible, we could have spent another 2 years planning for the climate action plan and put all that staff work into just planning. We could have planned. Portland makes the best plans. There's no doubt about it. But I would like to stop planning, because we know what we need to do and actually get into the answering the questions of how, who benefits, who's burdened, how do we solve for those things? Let's get the policy staff that are writing plans and get them out into the finance angle. How are we paying for things? That's the stuff that's important to me. And that's why I'm hoping we can shift our energy from the planning process into the implementation process, because Megan, the questions you're asking are absolutely in our minds. And we want to get to the work on solving those challenges. So I think I'm going to stop and just give Andrea space to walk through some of the greatest hits of the greatest hits document.
Thanks, Donnie. And I guess all I'd add to that is that's why it's really only a 3-year horizon on this climate emergency work plan. Some of the things that are in here, we've already done. So we're going to tick those off and make room for the next set of things in a couple of years. That's why I didn't have as long of a timeline as some of our previous plans. Things change really quickly. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. How's that looking for folks? Good. All right. So you know what we're here to talk about. As Donnie said, a lot of this background, but the point that I was wanting to really get across is that the council did the work of acknowledging the climate emergency, but now's the time to really put some action together. And so this was our response to that declaration, and how do we move the work forward. So really wanted to communicate some urgency. While we were working on the plan, the IPCC, this is the international body of scientists that document and report on climate, came out with their most dire report to date. They're all dire, but this one was like more dire, and it smacked me kind of across the face. And because resilience in the last couple of years has always been important, it's become even more important as the impacts are already here and being felt, especially by frontline communities, that a lot of the energy has been shifting to how do we prepare and adapt for climate change, and absolutely need to have those conversations. But what this report highlighted is that without these deep emissions reductions, if we don't decarbonize as quickly as possible, we can't adapt. We will be beyond our capability to respond and be resilient. So emissions reduction and resilience are equally necessary and urgent. So that was part of this messaging. We wanted to communicate easily we have 2 basic goals around carbon reductions. We have an interim goal at 2030, so that's 7 years from now. We have to get from where we are here, to that red circle, that 50%. So it's about another 30% emission reductions in the next 7 years. Like, let that sink in for a second. And then our ultimate end goal is net zero emissions by 2050. So within the course of one kiddo's lifetime, we have to basically get rid of the entire fossil fuel economy. And it's really now or never. So the next 3 years are incredibly important. As Donnie mentioned, these are going to be ongoing efforts, but the foundational work that we do in the next 3 years puts us on a pathway to even being able to achieve these goals. But we didn't want to just be all doom and gloom, because it's not the only story. There are pathways and there are ways out of this, and we know what they are. The science of decarbonization is pretty well known. It just takes the political will and answering those hard questions about who, as Johnny mentioned, who pays, who benefits, who's burdened. But the work plan was intended to show council that these are the things that they can do to make the worst case scenario not the worst case scenario. Just to back up a little, how do we know where we're supposed to go? Is because we've been doing a lot of analytics and tracking of our carbon emissions inventory since we have a 1990 baseline, so we know where the carbon comes from. Basically, this is how we look at it by sector. So transportation and buildings, which are the purple and blue, that's where most of the local carbon emissions come from how we get around and how we heat and power and live in our buildings. Industry is the next biggest component after that. So this is another way of looking at it. Our emissions come from electricity and gasoline. These are sources connected to that other slide. So when you look at these things together, what it suggests is how do we move forward and how do we address, what are the strategies for addressing the carbon that comes from these sectors and these sources? So electricity, again, really, really big. That's why you'll see in the work plan activities focused on the electric grid, transportation, working on gasoline and diesel, and natural gas. That's the other big fossil fuel that goes into heating our buildings and powering our industry. So in the work plan, you'll see this pathways analysis. This suggests how we move forward. After we take all of the actions that are in the work plan, this is kind of, how we get to net zero. And they sum up what you see in the colored bars is really the remaining emissions over the next 30 years. And so if you look at the work plan, all of the high impact priorities map to these basic sectors around electricity supply, buildings, transportation, industry, and then there's this catch-all category. So a lot of our emissions that are coming near term are coming from the grid and coming through buildings and transportation. And in the more out years is where we see those reductions in from industry and transportation. Transportation is a hard one. We're relatively less advanced, and we have many more actors in the transportation space that make it really a kind of a tough sector to address. But over the next 3 years, we're prioritizing our electricity supply, working with PBOT on their transportation scenarios, electric vehicles. This replacing diesel with biofuels is something we just passed last week at City Council. It's a huge step forward in getting to our 2030 goal. So check that one off the list. And then we're really starting to ramp up our work in the industrial sector. So that's the decarbonization side. I know folks in this room are probably more interested, potentially, I don't know, on the resilient side, but this is kind of in the work plan, those 43 items. It is half and half. There are over 20 resilience items out of the 43, and a lot of them have to do with things that you all care about. So on page 11 is where of the work plan, I can put a link in the chat. It's on our website. That's where the resilient side really starts. And on page 12 are the items around trees. So maybe to get back to one of the previous questions, the things that are in there are things that were pretty well known, as Donnie mentioned. So updating and implementing the urban forestry management plan is in there, updating Title 11 regulations, and expanding tree planting in East Portland. Those are the things that were focused in these next 3 years, in addition to a range of other areas that are that were identified by all the bureaus as priorities for this plan. And I think I'm just going to stop there. That's pretty much, I can go back to any slide or I can stop sharing, but that's the synopsis of what's in the plan. And happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Andrea. I'd like to do a little, just to see if there are any questions to start here, see if we could kick it off with maybe going around in a round robin, see if we can get everyone to contribute. And if you don't have question or comment response, that's fine as well, just to pass, that's good. We start maybe in first name alphabetical. Adrian, do you want to go first?
Sure. It's kind of a follow-up to my first question, which is, and I realize that the BPS and BES are at a high level here in terms of collecting this information and sort of selling it to city council and so forth. But who is responsible, especially for the specific goals in the next 2 to 3 years, to actually, tying it to very specific outcomes and people? What's the plan for getting to that and achieving those goals?
If I understand the question, is it sort of just the broader emissions reduction goals or just the goals of implementing the objectives?
Sort of implementing the objective. How do you actually get to an outcome? I'm interested in how you visualize that.
Great. So great question. So if in the work plan, we identified the bureau or bureaus in some cases that are sort of the stewards of that objective, right? And as we alluded to earlier, every item that's in there exists in some shape or form in either an existing work plan, strategic plan amongst the bureaus. So already we can point to pick an item. I'm just going to look and randomly say LU. Oh, that's BPS. LU2, land use 2 is a BPS land use program that it's already in our work plan. We're working on it. And so next year we'll be able to give an update on where BPS, where BPS is at on that item, hire 2 staff, community engagement strategy initiated, whatever the steps we're at. So on a line by line, each bureau will be able to give us an update on those items. Now, how those items each individually impact our emissions, whether it's sequestration, just reduction, or on the adaptation side, infrastructure investment, some of those initiatives are going to take years to realize, right? So anecdotally, Andrew just talked about the renewable fuel standard. We just passed it. It doesn't go into full effect till 2030, which means we won't see true emissions reductions. We'll see some gains early, but not till after 2030. So these are all sort of like long game implementations for the emissions reductions or sequestration or investments. But to your point about who's held accountable for each of the items, it's the bureau in that lead column.
Yeah, I was referring more to the overall outcome. So if we know we need to do X to the grid to get to our goal, how do we know that actually we're tracking that from A to Z? Because each bureau is individually, working on their plans, but there's only one place where the overall goal for Portland is being synthesized. So I can't quite track that from A to Z yet.
So this is where it gets tricky. It's really difficult for us to show how each objective is realizing the gains. We can see the full data. So we do produce a dashboard. Right now it's static. For each sector, we can see the emissions, right? So transportation sector, industrial sector, commercial, residential, electric, all those spaces. But to then draw down explicitly like which policy lever we pulled, reduced what piece, what electron was saved or changed is a lot harder to do. So there's always going to be this disconnect between the objectives individually versus the meta emissions, the reductions that we realize. So for example, when we switch the grid, it's going to take policy change. It's going to take investment. It's going to take probably people paying more rates for their electric bill at home. There's all these different levers that are going to be pulled to realize the 100% renewable electricity grid.
But I want to add to that. And so what is in the plan, though, is the specific part that the city has some control over. So the utilities are regulated and directed at the state level, and they have goals that will get us to emissions-free electricity in the state by 2040. But our goals are more aggressive, and we have some levers to pull. And so we try to pull out the piece of this overall ecosystem that we actually can talk about and be accountable for. So I'm accountable to bringing a program before council to talk about rates for 100% clean electricity for all residential customers in Portland by 2030. Like, so when you turn on your light, your default option is just 100% clean. That's on me to bring to city council, like on BPS, right? We committed to doing that. Not being responsible for the overall grid, that's out of our jurisdiction, but we have a component of it. And I should be able to answer what the city is doing and what BPS is doing on that particular piece. So that's how we tried to get a little bit more granular in the plan about what our responsibility was in these overall massive system changes.
The other one, anecdotally, just to even add more like complexity to this is we have a vehicle miles traveled reduction goal that PBOT, our Bureau of Transportation, is leading. That is largely dependent on a really reliable, safe, convenient transit system, right? Which we don't have as much influence over. So we're relying on TriMet to be a really outstanding service provider so that the city of Portland can meet our transportation reduction goals. So in that case, like, what are the levers that we're pulling there? We're working with TriMet. We're trying to be a better partner, rapid transit lanes, all the things that we control to assist TriMet to do their thing well so that we can see our vehicle miles traveled go down. So it's that complex. That's where it's never going to be as simple to say we pushed that button and emissions went down. Unfortunately, greenhouse gas emissions don't recognize bureaucratic borders or government boundaries.
Bruce, can we move to you?
I'll pass in the interest of people getting to say something who don't normally.
Okay. Who do we have? Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. And Donnie and Andrea, thank you very much for coming to our meeting today. It's great to hear from you. I wanted to pick up potentially on a thread which doesn't, I think, naturally fall into the categories that are in the climate action plan, but I think is very, very much a big part of it. And that has to do with making sure that we retain the large trees that we have. So as there are pressures for development, large trees are often the casualty. And we know that it takes decades for trees that are planted to achieve their full climate mitigating potential. And I would love to see something, some more focus on that in the climate action plan. And this might seem off the wall, but if you look at what's been going on with Portland development policies in the last decade, there's been a big emphasis on infill and getting more housing units. And this is important because we do have a housing crisis. But as we do it, a lot of times what happens is space for large trees kind of disappears. And I think when we're looking at this issue with a climate lens, we have to make sure that we retain the space for these large trees. And I mean, I think there are a lot of solutions that are more political rather than sort of infrastructure, and climate plans kind of focus on the infrastructure piece, but there are other political things. And I'll just throw this out, but if you look at, there's been a trend in Portland in the last decade of housing units being taken off the market and made into more tourist units through Airbnbs and things like that. And so that there are potential, that creates even more kind of need for housing units. And I think that, from a political standpoint, if we could look at what housing units are available now, but are not being used for full housing, some things like that. And I realize that's kind of a little off of what we're talking about here, but I think it all relates to having that space for large trees. And maybe if the city council could look at things like providing financial incentives and disincentives, for taking units off the market, we wouldn't have as much pressure to do so much infill where the trees get removed. So just wanted to throw that out.
Appreciate it, Dan. Just to quickly note that land use is one of the most powerful tools the city has to combat climate change. Actually, density, access to services, walkability, active mobility, those things are all predicated on good land use policy. And the unintended consequences of infill about losing trees, that's very real. So those are all part of the calculations that we want to take into account. And you're absolutely right. The elephant in the room about, units being turned into temporary rentals is a bit of a thing for sure. Political.
Yeah, it was interesting too that Councillor Hardesty presented some information at a council meeting a few years ago that showed that there were 10,000 available luxury housing units that weren't occupied. And when you think about future building, if more luxury units continue to be built, that's not going to solve the housing crisis either. So that kind of all relates back to the, this issue about space for large trees. And I realize I might be reaching a little bit here, but anyway, just wanted to throw that.
Great, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for your response, Donnie. Megan.
Oh, I think Leah is
Oh,
before.
Leah,
me.
sorry, yes. I don't know I don't know my alphabet, but Leah.
I will just touch on something that Daniel said that really struck me with actually Vivek's research, which was showing that the trees we already have are growing faster than our newly planted trees. So in a sense, our canopy inequity continues to widen, like because of that, because our west side we know has these amazing big trees, but they add canopy more quickly than the new plantings that we might have. So that really struck me of like the need to keep the trees we have is huge. And I know we often talk about planting trees and we all see that, some of our new plantings aren't making it because they're not being cared for, but really that issue of keeping the trees that we have, kind of echoing what Daniel said, is super important. And I just want to appreciate what you said about de-siloing, because so many of these problems are holistic. I love that term of multi-solving, of we make this change of increasing our canopy, we get health benefits, we get traffic slowing, which it decreases traffic fatalities, we get quality of life for our residents and cooling. So that issue of cost, I think we always want to weigh that with, well, what are we already paying for the system that we have today that we don't recognize, like our air quality deaths, things like that. So like kind of when it comes to the need to sort of, as you said, the political will and selling it to the community, like when we make some of these changes that address multiple problems that we have, that we've accepted as just like part of life, we don't have to live like that. We don't have to have bad air quality all the time in our city. You know what I mean? So I guess I just bring that up to say, like, I appreciate the de-siloing conversation because I think that's a huge part of this, and just recognizing that when we solve some of these problems, we get these multiple benefits that have costs associated to them as well, that save our community lifespans and money and quality of life and all of that. So yeah. Not a question, just a comment and appreciation. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Leah. And then we'll go to Megan and then Melinda.
Yeah, I already soapbox, so I actually have a question, which is just like, I really appreciate seeing the numbers around the reduction. And of course, we think about the sequestration side of things. So, Andrea or Donna, I'm really curious, like if there was one sequestration implementation strategy that you are really seeing within this, like where would the muscle be to like do one big sequestration push on behalf of the city? What would that be?
That is such a fun question. God, I mean,
I love that question. I don't know the answer to it though.
I think it is not because of audience, honestly, but full throttle investment in our urban canopy feels like an obvious win because of the co-benefits that Leah just acknowledged. So that feels like the right place to just go all in on something if we were going to do that from a sequestration perspective. I am skeptical about technology, like trying to build machines to sequester. That feels weird to me. And I don't think that anyway, like a place like Portland is going to be a spot for that kind of thing anyway. The other thing is, I know this sounds really weird, but tangentially, we're also looking at this. Is going to be crazy because what climate, the health of our rivers and the natural areas around them, and the benefits that they're providing, both to habitat and just the access to the rivers for people. We got to look at that too. Like, how are we taking care of our rivers and the role that they play in our micro ecosystem of the region? So less of a carbon move for sequestration, but the co-benefits of that and ultimately the sequestration opportunities indirectly benefited from that would be amazing as well. But good question. I appreciate that. And if you don't mind, I'd love to think about that some more, and we'll get back to you all. Andrea, thoughts?
That's what I would have. I mean, it was very compelling around the large trees. I totally get that. And I think the urban canopy is, and I know it's struggling, so it makes sense to me. But yes, I think it would be great to talk to some other folks and get some more feedback on that.
All right, thanks. Melinda?
Yeah, I was most interested in kind of the interagency work and accountability. And I was just wondering if there's some sort of structure or intent on interim tracking that maybe these individual departments were not going to do on their own, that are just, I'm interested in the accountability issue and how it's tracked and how you're getting this data and how often that happens.
Can I answer that, Donnie?
Sure, you can, but I also want to just acknowledge changes. Folks, we are going to be going through some incredible changes in government in the next 2 years. So anything we say today is going to look vastly different in 2 years. And I'm not just talking about charter reform for council representation. Yes, I did, Ivory. We're talking about just how we structure ourselves as bureaus and bureaucracy. So, but please, Andrea, proceed.
I'm thinking of it more like very tactically, because we have to go to council every year to report our progress. And so it's like starting in January, like I already have, I have to reach out to all the bureaus that contributed to the climate emergency work plan and figure out how we are going to report. As accountability and transparency are super important to me. I think we had gone a little quiet on our climate reporting for a while for a lot of good reasons, but it's time to be just doing better on that. And so I want to talk, PBOT has a huge role, and so do the other bureaus, and how we report back our progress on this. And we have to get our ducks in a row. So that will take us 7 months to do. So I don't want it to be lost on anyone how, while transparency and reporting are super important, how resource intensive it is, especially in the form of government we have currently, and in the midst of all this transition to the new thing, whatever that's going to look like. So extra challenging, but committed to it. And Donnie mentioned our static dashboard, those numbers will be updated. And then the goal is to get to something more interactive over time. And we have some new staff starting, so we're building that capacity.
And I want to just acknowledge this, and this isn't just like, smoke to say it. The leadership around the city right now are truly committed to climate action. Regardless, like, so Director Uchiyama and Director Long, Director Salmer, Director Warner, they're all like, when we meet, because we all get together, climate is on our conversation list every single time. Like, what are we doing? How are we activating this? The big moves coming from the federal IRA, we're talking about that. How do we leverage that? So I'll just tell you, and acknowledging that with Jen and Brian, we're working with our PSEF program, the fund, to activate resources for tree work with their leadership and their guidance. So we're trying to, work across the bureaus already. And that way, when we ask for information, they'll give it to us. No, just kidding. But the point is that the climate work is so intrabureau at this point. Like, there's no one bureau. Like, even though there's a lead, everybody's chipping in for policy analysis, financial analysis, funding, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's the question about accountability and follow through is important. But I think there's leadership in place right now that gives a damn. So I feel pretty good about it.
Nice, thank you.
Thanks. We're moving to Roberta.
Hi, thanks. So I'm going to I guess build on something Daniel was talking about, but we have to recognize that, in terms of trees, sequestration in the city is important, but I think for trees, resilience is its primary function. It's where the action is, and 50%-ish of our canopy is on private property. And, make no mistake, we are losing space for trees. We are continuing to lose space for trees to development and impervious surfaces. And so that's why it really jumps out at us that the goals to reduce impervious surfaces that are not only in the climate preparation strategy, but in the comprehensive plan, new directive policies, call for looking at how to develop in a way where we can get a handle on impervious surfaces. So we were struck that in like the heat and smoke section, there was no mention of impervious surfaces that are the primary cause of heat, and that we're just going to get hotter and hotter as we lose space for trees. So hoping that we, and Andrea, you said that resilience is equally important to climate mitigation. And I think that's true, but until we really look that one right in the face in terms of how we integrate our goals for housing and development and managing impervious surfaces to reduce heat and to retain room to not only preserve trees, but plant new ones. We have a lot of money going into planting trees. It's the new thing, right? Planting trees. We're losing space to plant them. And if we planted every single street tree space in the city, we wouldn't get the heat reduction that we need across the city. In terms of the question, there's a discussion on page 17, I think it was, about infrastructure planning and construction. And I liked that it said, we're now going to be looking at climate information as we do our capital projects. And but it didn't say anything about addressing resilience in that. And I think in terms of what we really have a handle on, our own capital projects are something we can take responsibility for. And I'm curious how you see working with the bureaus to incorporate climate resilience into our transportation projects, into our, particularly transportation, because there's so much impervious surface associated with it, but others as well, incorporating resilience and having that be routine as we look at climate and our infrastructure.
Those are absolutely fair questions, and it is touching at the burden that city staff are facing when we're managing all the demands about what each project is supposed to deliver on. And as Daniel mentioned earlier about the pressure to accelerate housing development, focus on infill so we can reduce vehicle miles traveled, stop growing out but growing up, and what that's doing to the capacity for tree growth and new trees. It was acknowledged earlier about maintenance of the existing canopy we do have. And then of course you touched on impervious spaces in our city, what we're doing to reduce that and how development can shape that. It's on our radar. I don't want to acknowledge that we haven't been as effective at ensuring that those mandates are met as we're trying to navigate a lack of development in the city. We have to evaluate how we're putting pressure, what pressure we're putting on the system to ensure that we are increasing that canopy space.
Right. Well, I will not take up too much time with a question. I'll just make a comment, maybe just to close us out, because we are over time here. And again, really appreciate Donnie, Andrea coming in, checking in with us. I just go back to that issue of information in terms of best laid plans, right? So there's a long history of creating work plans and cities creating work plans, and then fulfilling them is of course the enormous amount of work that you're all embarking upon now. So the extent to which we can be of assistance to you, I will at least, I'm rotating off, but I'll at least try to speak for some of my colleagues here in terms of being able to assist you in moving some of these big agendas forward. We have a big I'm hoping we have a significant role. In fact, our next agenda item is specific to your T-1 on page 12 of the work plan, is the urban forestry management plan update. And so we're going to be playing a significant role in that. It looked like to me you kind of pushed a lot into that. And so the extent to which we can incorporate these things coming up in the conversation today within the work plan, I'm hoping you'll be receptive to future letters, be willing to engage with us, and of course look to us for any support in terms of being able to fulfill not just T-1 and T-2 and T-3, but also thinking about the other aspects in which there's intersecting benefits that the urban forest can play. So with that, I just really thank you again, Donnie and Andrea, for coming in. Would love to stay in touch, and feel free to reach out anytime, or staff as well. We're working on this, other staff as well as working on this. Appreciate your time, and take good care. Happy holidays. Happy New Year.
Thanks, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Be well.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. That was really that was really a good first start. I think it's the first conversation of several that we're going to have to get into. There was a number of questions. I don't know about you. I was feeling like, oh, I wish there was a bit more there. I would love to hear a bit more, but we'll keep that conversation going, I'm hoping, and have them maybe come back in a year or so and check in on a update, depending on what their schedules look like in terms of those evaluations and updates. With that, let me turn it over to you, Belinda. I think we're going to transition over to another really big conversation about the urban forestry management plan, scope of work. There was some material sent out to you as well, so hopefully you've had a chance to review that. And We have a good about 35 minutes for this one to dig in.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so I think because we're a little bit short on time, I just want to make a few sort of key points about the document, the scope document that hopefully you've all seen, and then we'll use the rest of the time just for discussion to hear what your thoughts are on it. So I just want to highlight that, the scope document, it includes some background information for why we're developing the plan and why now, the goals, timeline, project team, and scope of work. I think the goals are really sort of our kind of internal framework for what we're going to be doing with the plan and how we're going to be doing it. So I think because of our time, it'd be great to just focus most of our discussion on the goals and scope itself, since those are kind of the most urgent and guiding items right now. So just want to highlight for the goals, they're sort of process oriented, outcome oriented. It's maybe not an exhaustive list, but if there's anything that you think we're missing in that list, we'd like to hear that feedback. If there's anything you think needs to be further prioritized, let us know. And then in terms of the scope of work, the sort of content of the plan will really be, the organization is still to be determined, but really what we'll be including is an existing conditions or state of the urban forest assessment. So that'll be looking at both the health of the urban forest, how well does our urban forest set us up for being resilient and adaptive to climate change in terms of what we plant and how it's planted and how it's maintained, but also what are the policies and processes for how we manage our urban forests. So who's involved, how do we do it? Do our policies support what we want to see with our urban forests and keeping it healthy? And then aside from that sort of existing conditions assessment, there'll also be the most, one of the more important parts of developing our vision and goals. So what do we want to see in the future over the next 10 years in terms of, again, sort of all aspects of preservation and planting and maintenance and operations and management. And then the rest of the plan will be how do we meet those goals? So what are the actions that we need to take? Who needs to be involved with those and implementing those actions? What's our timeline? How are we going to report our progress on that to the public so we can be held accountable? What metrics are most important to highlight? How often do we report back? Those kinds of things. So that's sort of the content. It's really, where are we? What are we doing? How are we doing it? What can we be doing better? Where do we want to be? And then how do we get there? And for all of that, we'll be heavily informed by community and stakeholder engagement. And also we'll be applying, I think, sort of a climate change and equity and inclusion lens to all of that work. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up in case there are questions about what we've presented and if there's anything that you'd like to hear more about.
All right, where do we want to start here? We're starting with goals. Anything missing, anything revision, any observations about the goals to start with, I think is what Belinda was asking about.
Roberta?
Yeah, thanks. I guess, I have lots of comments and I won't go into them, but I'll for sure. But just process wise, this is going to be discussed at the policy committee meeting on Monday. Just so we're all clear, we're sort of assuming that we would take what we hear today and then discuss it further at the policy committee. And then we've been given December 23rd as a deadline to get at least our initial comments to the staff. And so can we clarify up front whether the commission is, whether that's kind of a good process and whether we can just do that at the policy committee meeting on Monday, reflecting what we hear today, and then move some written comments to the staff later next week. And I don't know if we need maybe we end with a motion to vote on whether we should do that or not, but I want to flag that just kind of is where we're headed here. I think on the goals, it's something that is woven through the goals, but also the scope. It's actually in the intro as well as I think it's how the relationship between the city bureaus and this project is characterized and what the goals are around that. It's sort of implied that the bureaus will be, to improve collaboration among city bureaus and partners and enhance opportunities for planting and so forth. I see the role of the bureaus as being more than community stakeholders or more than just stakeholders to the process. I think as we were hearing, and even in Jen's report, I mean, our bureaus need to be co-owners of the plan. They need to be partners and they need to be implementers with Parks and Rec, Urban Forestry for sure. And so for me, the notion of building ownership, awareness, partnership for this plan with other city bureaus should be sort of woven through in the goals and then in the scope. So, and even in the intro, it talks about the current plan doesn't currently reflect the capacity and the expertise of urban forestry, but it also doesn't reflect the capacity, expertise, and role of the other bureaus either. So I feel like that's kind of woven throughout the process. And just while we're on the topic, when we get to the scope of work and we talk about engagement, I really support you in including a strategy that we need to develop a strategy for keeping the bureau directors and the city council apprised and engaged in the process. It's going to be a long process, and not only the technical staff, but the leadership of the bureaus and the city council are going to have to buy into this as well to get the horsepower to do all the, to move these recommendations forward and actually implement the plan. So that's kind of my thing.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. I think you are spot on with everything that you just mentioned. So yeah, we've shared the scoping document with staff in other bureaus and discussed it, and we'll definitely, over the next few months before we actually kick off the project, we'll be having a lot of conversations with how we can involve staff in other bureaus, because I agree. I think we all agree that ownership across bureaus is going to be really critical to the success.
Yeah,
Thanks
absolutely. And I just want to add in, Roberta, I appreciate the comment about city council, because one of the things that we're paying attention to is form of government is changing, and the way that we interact with city council is going to be very different over the course of as we develop this plan. So it's definitely something we're paying attention to as well. Thanks.
Adrian?
Yeah, I thought the goals were really overall fantastic, very comprehensive. I want to second what Roberta said, that if urban forestry is in fact taking on responsibility for the overall canopy, then the concept of a goal being what are the specific expectations of the partnering agencies, to contribute to that canopy growth or improvement is important versus just a vague collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think one thing I've been thinking about and reviewing what we had in the last urban forest management plan and changes we'd like to see in this one is in the implementation and really, working through whatever our recommendations and actions end up being, is taking those to different bureaus and saying, okay, what can you work on, and putting your name in the plan next to that action. So everyone knows who's working on what, and there's some accountability for that.
Right, great. Daniel?
Thanks. First of all, I just want to say how exciting I find it that this project is kicking off. It seems like in the years that I've been involved in this commission, like the very first meeting, it was like, we have to update the forest management plan. And the need has grown, but there's been this recognition that it's such a big job that you need extra staff and budget. And it hasn't been until now until that's happened. So it's great that this is happening. So I'm excited. I'm reflecting mainly because of the previous talk we just had from the director of BPS, how so much is changing right now that affects trees, not only in the world, but here in Portland. And when you see like right on the first page here, it talks about how the plan was last updated in 2004. It occurs to me that no matter what happens in the next few years, something is going to change that's really going to impact this plan. And I would love to see something as part of the scope that says that, you know, on a periodic basis, we're going to at least go back and look at kind of the major things and see if anything in the external world that has changed enough that we need to go back and at least tweak the urban forest management plan. In other words, a way to make it more of a living plan rather than a static plan. So if there's some way of building that into what we see here in the scope of work, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Thanks.
Yeah, Daniel, I'll add just because I think that's such a great point. I might have mentioned this in a previous meeting, but something really interesting about Title 11 is in the commentary version of Title 11, which kind of gives some background information on what was intended with the language. It really envisioned the urban forest plan, which is what the Title 11 calls the urban forest management plan, just calls it the urban forest plan, which is why you see that term in the scope, as sort of a umbrella term, that there may be multiple plans underneath that. And so it is, I think that does kind of leave open this opportunity for doing exactly what you're describing, which is we developed this overarching plan, but we might identify need for more specificity and individual planning efforts, you know, over the course of the 10 years that the plan is intended to cover. So I just think that's a really, really important point.
Thanks, Brian. Bruce.
You're on mute, Bruce.
In reviewing some of the history of the Street Tree Advisory Committee, which is the predecessor of the Urban Forestry Commission, and what we're doing currently, it seems like what's happened over the time, there's been a great increase in the number of staff in urban forestry and the professionalism within urban forestry. And there's also been a great decrease in the amount of responsibilities taken on by volunteers and the community. In the rewrite or the update of the urban forest management plan, I think it's really important that it be clear to community members. First of all, the community members buy into it. We have a very significant forestry advocacy community within Portland that much of it feels very disenfranchised by urban forestry practices. And, you know, that's for good or bad reasons, for whatever, but there's going to need to be compelling work done to convince that community that, yes, indeed, you are part of the solution. Yes, indeed, we appreciate your work. Yes, indeed, we want you involved. Yes, we have a huge urban forestry professional staff that are paid to do work, but we can get so much more work done if we have the political capital of those advocates also. So there is verbiage in the scope that begins to address that, but I think it's going to take a real sell job to change the sentiment within many community members in Portland. So it's not easy. I don't have a solution on that. I'm just pointing out, yes, there is some language that touches on that. But in my opinion, it's a really important matter if we want to indeed have community engagement in the urban forest that we have.
Thanks for that comment, Bruce. I think, yeah, that's an excellent point. It's something I think about all the time. Brian and I earlier this week were talking about what we can be doing even before we start the formal process to be building relationships and talking to different community groups. I think it's something, you know, at another meeting, not right now, but we can spend some time talking about what those conversations can look like and what that process could look like, because I'm sure you all have some good insights for that. So we can find another time to talk about that in more detail. But I agree. I think that's an incredibly critical point, and there will be a huge amount of budget from as part of the plan devoted to community engagement, because yeah, it's definitely going to take a village to preserve and protect the urban forest, and we want everyone on board. Megan, I think you're next.
Thanks. Big thanks, Belinda, for your leadership on this, and Brian. You both are great. This may not be an original thought, but like one thing I was really thinking about, it's so interesting to have this conversation framed after the BPS conversation, right? And having the BPS director be coming for the first time, right, in like Vivek's tenure. And it's kind of getting at what Daniel and Roberta were saying. I'm really trying to think about what it means to have other bureau buy-in, like in a deep way, like really like, you know, I hear both of you really resonating with like, yes, how do we do this? But I really think like, I always fear this thing that happens where the bureaus are like, we have so many competing priorities and where's the money going to come from? And, you know, like it is, yes, that's a true statement, but like, how do we get the like deep buy-in that all of these bureaus are going to be implementing this with it? And kind of in Daniel's comment, right? Not only is it a living document, which is great, but like really how is it in how do we truly imbue beyond kind of what's in there? Because you're saying this, like that it's an implementing document, because I worry that we create, kind of to Donnie's point, we create a document and it sits on a shelf. I'm not saying that's your intent, but like, I just want it to be the guiding document for the city bureaus to implement it. So I don't think I'm saying anything original, so I apologize. I'm just really trying to think, how do we get BPS and PBA and everyone in a deep buy-in way to help us do this? Because we're not going to get to those climate resiliency goals we were talking about if they're not invested in this in a deep way. So sorry for kind of rambling, but.
No, I think that's a great point. I think in my mind, I mean, there's obviously, you know, things you can do in a plan to help with implementation, like budgets and timelines and identifying partners. But I also think a really important part is the process of developing the plan itself and using that, like this opportunity to build those relationships, get buy-in, so that when we have an action plan, everybody is already on board. So we'll continue to be thinking very carefully about how, you know, what's the best way that we can do that. I think that's a great point, Megan. Any other thoughts?
I have several thoughts as well. Just to maybe frame up a couple of things really quickly. There's some things in this that just seem like they're a pretty big lift. I think we're getting at those things, and the how is not really our agenda right now. I totally get that. We're really talking about what is it we want to move towards and what are the big things. Though if we put one of the what things is like urban forest health, I'm just going to pick that thing. We have a street tree inventory. There's another one embarking, it sounds like. So we get a sense of that. But overall, urban forest health, given emerald ash borer, what we've heard about, given potential other stressors, like there are, I guess, one is that there are some big lifts that trying to characterize urban forest health, given what we know and how hard it is to do that on a kind of citywide or region-wide basis. To what extent are you looking at potentially leveraging state and other resources to be able to fulfill some of the harder things to do, urban forest health being one of them? Because I mean, I suspect unless the consultancy can do everything from very technical like analyses that haven't been even examined yet, like trying to figure out the health of ash trees, which is a whole thing in and of itself, to like engaging communities and being culturally responsive, like that ask is just so enormous. And I'm trying to think about like, where can you leverage, are you thinking about leveraging other resources to be able, and other organizations and other groups to be able to move forward on that agenda a bit more effectively to be able to fulfill these big goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I mean, we do have a lot of existing data out there, fortunately. So we do have those inventories and some other assessments that have been completed. So we'll certainly be incorporating those. I think we also, want to recognize that other groups and institutions in the community have also completed reports, whether that's more detailed and technical analyses, or if it's community engagement that relates to access to tree canopy and opinions on that. So we don't want to limit our analyses to just looking at information that's collected by the city. It will certainly be broader than that. I also think, we're anticipating that it'll be a consultant team that we work with to do this work. It won't just be one contractor who has expertise in urban forest canopy analysis. It'll be a team of that plus, hopefully local groups involved in organizations that typically focus just on engagement, because I agree it's a huge lift to expect one firm to do all of it and to do a good job at all of it. So we will be planning for that. And Brian, I'm not sure if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, just to build on all of that. One of the exciting things that we've been struggling to find time in a UFC meeting to brief you all on is a partnership that we have with the U.S. Forest Service on the urban forest inventory analysis, which I think we are actually going to be able to bring to the January meeting. Nick Day, Southern Forestry, led that project, and so it's a partnership with the U.S. Forest Service where we have monitoring sites all over the city. And this does give us forest-wide metrics in terms of species diversity, health information. And so that's one of the partnerships that we have been able to leverage. And I think as part of this urban forest management plan, it's going to be, looking at all the data that we have available, and how we can use that to inform our work. So yeah, Vivek, you're definitely getting to some of these harder nuts to crack, but we do have some good things in place, and I think part of the task of the updating the plan will be how do we leverage all of that is available to us right now.
I'll also just add that I think we know that we can't do everything that we want with this plan, but we can at least assess what we have and what we can do, and then some of our next steps can be to dive deeper into some of those other items and see how we can work with partners or other bureaus to complete some of that work. Roberta.
Well, I want to commend you for a pretty strong scope, and also the implementation strategy piece of it. We just went over this big work plan with BPS. I support this plan having an accompanying work plan of its own, and I think that toward the living document kind of comment, having that work plan be something like a 3-year work plan, so that it's not too long of a timeline and it can be revisited along with maybe a touch point back to the plan itself is a really good idea. And so that's great. I think that in terms of heavy lifting, updating the canopy targets is going to be interesting to try to figure out how to do that, because they do need to be updated and they need to reflect kind of the world we live in and the world we're headed toward. And there's a lot we don't know. So I think figuring out how that's going to happen in a feasible way, I definitely would support the notion of targets for either specific situations, areas, uses, et cetera, versus an overall city target. An overall city target is not really helpful, particularly when distribution, quality and quantity are really what we're after, all of those things. The one thing that, and it also harkens back to this conversation we had some minutes ago, the plan calls for like an assessment of management framework and identify opportunities and constraints. And I'd like to see a little more beef to that section, because that's going to be really important. And I support and to state some examples of what we mean by that. And identifying barriers. I mean, it's one thing to talk about cost and, preservation and planning and how's Title 11 working and all that, but this notion of really identifying some of the key barriers or policy issues and conflicts we might have. And I think, losing space for trees to impervious surfaces, buildings and otherwise is part of is an example of that, as well as, the street tree maintenance thing and so forth. So I think And then where it calls for looking at Title 11 and how Title 11 is performing, I think we need to go further than that in this plan and have whoever's doing this work with us look at Title 33 as well, the Portland zoning code, because what's allowed to be developed, and perhaps along with some transportation related rules and guidelines too, but kind of sussing out the relationship, but not the whole world of it, really honing in on what's important. And I guess those are sort of my biggest comments. And I think one of the problems with the current plan is the recommendation list is too long. I mean, you look at the urban forest management plan, I was looking at going, oh my God, it's too long. And so it's good to have those things, but if maybe through the work plan, it can be toned out, or maybe we end up with 3 big initiatives, something that kind of focuses the attention. The 10-year plan, it sounds like a long time, but it's not that long to get real things done. So maybe we end up with less of a laundry list at the end and more of, and having the scope talk about prioritizing recommendations, not just recommendations, but a process for prioritizing, and talk about community engagement. There's a real opportunity there. So thanks again for taking this on. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. I think that's a great idea. And I think as part of that, in terms of what are the recommendations and the actions coming out of it, prioritizing what are things that are currently funded right now. I think sometimes it includes very aspirational things where we hope to have funding for, but that means we're kind of on hold to make any progress on those. So yeah, I love the idea of having like a distinct list over a 3-year time period, so we can get rolling right out of it. The other thing I love bringing up Title 33 as well, because one of the things that Belinda and I have discussed a lot is like what is the sort of code aspect of this work. And one of the things that we kind of felt like was it'll be really difficult for a consultant to come in and really understand Title 11 and Title 33 and make recommendations. So what we kind of veered towards and pivoted towards was, well, what if we had them do sort of a review of peer cities and make recommendations on what's working well in other cities. So less so of a review of our current code, and more of a report on what are some of the best practices in terms of land use, in terms of local tree or ordinances that we could learn from and try to implement here. So just give you a background of like where we've been kind of trying to balance what is the right way to engage the consultant and what's the best role for them, because we would love to see some recommended Title 11 and even Title 33 changes coming out of the project. So so yeah, that's definitely an area we would love some feedback on, because it's a bit of a challenge where we're trying to get our heads around also.
There are consultants out there who do know Title 33 really well, though, and do know and can quickly learn Title 11 or vice versa. And it's not insurmountable to get a handle on where we're, what the key issues are. But that's a good, I like the peer cities thing a lot.
That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think also because Roberta, you mentioned canopy targets. I agree with everything you had to say about that. And as part of this, we'll also be doing a peer review of how other cities are using their canopy targets and whether that's working well or not. And that will certainly inform what we consider as part of this planning process.
Thanks, Roberta. Daniel.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Roberta. When you said mentioned about impervious surfaces, it reminds me of something that I'd love to see at least a little placeholder as part of the scope, and that is that in the last 5 years, there have been several policy discussions we've been involved with that relate to land zone commercial and industrial, and that is going to be a big piece, or I think, of the climate action plan, but also as it relates to urban forestry and some of the issues we've dealt with in this commission, like the interaction with jobs and space for trees and that kind of thing. I would love to see somewhere in here, when talking about stakeholder engagement, that commercial and industrial owners are part of that. Just, I know it's going to be that. I know no one's going to forget that, but I would love to see like some notice of that, so we make sure that we also get that community involved in the solutions and canopy goals.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, we're working on the community engagement strategy, sort of starting to think about it. It obviously won't be finalized until we partner with our consultant team, but it's something we're constantly thinking about. And part of that process will be developing a list of sort of groups like developers, utilities, nonprofits, all those groups you want to hear from. And I'll certainly happy to circulate that list amongst you all, so we can make sure we're not forgetting anyone. I didn't see who was next, whether it's Melinda or Adrian, but
Linda and then Adrian, and then we gotta wrap it. It's a hard stop at 11.
Yeah, just really quickly, as part of the sister city analysis, it would be great to look at what incentives the development and construction industries are being given to increase impervious service and therefore planting areas, and in saving old trees. And so a lot of this implementation is going to be, how can we bribe or incentivize the developers to say, hey, we want you to keep this tree. We'll give you an extra story if you something like that. So that'd be a great thing to add to the sister city analysis.
yeah, that's a great point. I'll make a note of that to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think this is a minor point, but it came up in a couple of ways, and that's and it may be just my lack of knowledge of the field, but how much do we expect to be able to look to other cities and correlate their better outcomes with, say, a better tree code? And so that systematic review of what's happening in other cities, nationally and internationally, I see you sort of have it in there, but it's near the end. And you might want to look at sort of organizing the work a little bit along the timeline. It seems like, doing your systematic review of health effects or health benefits of the urban canopy and sort of what's happening in other more, say, successful cities and how that relates to the tree code should sort of come first before you get way down the road and say, okay, now let's look and see what others are doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think, this scope document, not everything is necessarily listed in order of operation, but certainly in our RFP and contracted process that, yeah, there's a few items where I want to make sure we do a sister city or peer city comparison and make sure we do that early on. So thanks for catching that. And then let's see, I think, is that everyone?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Belinda. This is a great start and ongoing conversation for us to keep apprised as to your thinking about this and where we can be of support to you as this as this particular project and plan develop. We're at time, and I'm looking to just kind of see if there's any last questions, comments, more generally, if we step back from the urban forest management plan or Donnie and Andrea's presentation, urban foresters report, any final closing thoughts, comments, walk-on items that we want to mark up before we close it out for the day or for the month or for the year?
Just that comment that Megan was really pushing for the street tree maintenance, and Donnie kind of said, we have a lot of priorities. So I keep thinking about how do we keep pushing that one up higher on the list, because it addresses so many of these issues. Yeah, so that'll be our thing to keep pushing.
Yeah, I want to echo that, Leah. Sometimes I'm like, I don't know if this is going anywhere, but I feel like I'll just shout it in every room with a powerful stakeholder until it gets us somewhere, so they keep hearing it. So that's always my goal. Like, I'll just keep shouting or talking nicely. Doesn't have to shout.
Vivek, I also was thinking about what you said about the kind of mini parks and the need for that and like using our land that way. And I think, should that be another one of our like shouting things that we say in every meeting? Because that really resonated with me, because I feel like if we know we need denser housing, we know we need development, we have a housing crisis, and having like the impact of those little cooling areas as almost like an emergency gathering place in the neighborhood. could be huge, and also for wildlife. Like it's a little pocket, and I think like, can we hold on to those little spaces, knowing that we still need to, again, we're going to lose unpaved private land that we have now, but like, is there ways the city can kind of like disperse those where they're needed? So is that one that we also want to be kind of like having as a, I don't know. I mean, I guess that's sort of outside of our purview maybe, but.
Personally, I don't think so, because there's money on the table from Metro to be able to basically put money on the table, and then they're buying land. And if the city can, and if any regional city can put money on the table to combine as a local share, that land can be purchased. And so I see lots every day in my Northeast neighborhoods as I'm biking, walking, driving around. Like, my goodness, that's been sitting there for over a decade, just like languishing, and all this development is happening around it, and yet there's a scarcity of green spaces in some of these neighborhoods. So it's like, well, anyway.
And like in East Portland, and maybe this is Gresham, I always forget where the boundary is, but there's like a Kmart that's closed, and I look at that parking lot and I think that could be a park, or we could do, like there's these little pockets that we could just envision such a better use for. So
that Kmart is slotted for a logistics trucking plant for Amazon.
Great.
Yeah, Willamette Week has been on top of that.
Oh.
I just put a link in the thing. So worst picture of me ever taken in my whole life, but nevertheless, I'll drop my vanity and just focus on the content of, I wrote this for Metro, trying to nudge them in that direction, but just background reading for something I'm hoping to push once I'm off the commission.
I have a quick question just around this too. Like, one thing is the city owns a lot of land in its own way. And I sometimes wonder, what is our engagement around some of just like how the city is using their land? So I live in North Portland, just south of Columbia Boulevard. BES owns an entire strip of land spanning this high traffic corridor and a high air pollution corridor. We have urban heat island, we have heavy industry, we have all of these things. And I just think I've tried, like, how is that land from a city perspective? Like it's kind of just land that they mow. And so I'm wondering, like, just in some of these bigger conversations as well, like there's active stakeholders that could be utilizing even the land they already have differently. So I don't know what that means, but I think about it all of the time.
Megan, our charge as a Forestry Commission is not only to advise Portland Parks and Rec, but to advise the city council. So I think it's fair game for us to be able to make suggestions for other bureaus.
Yeah, and I just always sometimes think it's, we're not trying to have to convince the developer or whoever. We're saying, city, you own this land, how are you storing it, right? So I guess I'm just thinking about all of the multitudes of ways to do it.
And also, Megan, congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
Everyone know? Megan's the new deputy.
Go ahead. No, you please.
I was going to say Megan's the new deputy director of Friends of Trees.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. Thanks.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
And I'll just note, now that there's not really the clear indication of shortage of funding per se, I mean, there is always, that's been our constant go-to for every thing the commission has been working on. The next few years, I think, are going to be really, really catalytic for all kinds of potential direction we could go, because we've often heard that, we don't have resource for this. We don't have resource for street tree maintenance. We don't have resource for outreach engagement. So with this little tranche of funding, or this large tranche of funding from PSEF, as well as the Sustainable Futures, as well as the IRA, I mean, it's really time to kind of think programmatically rather than project specific. And I'm really hoping we can keep this train moving in a direction, or keep this, I don't know, bicycle rolling in a direction that would be really productive for a lot of things. I think big visionary things that we brought up on the commission. So, well, we went over, and thanks for a little extra time. Really good. I wish we could do this a bit more often, just kind of casually exploring ideas too. It seems like such a valuable space to be spending time right now. But Let me officially close out the meeting then. Thanks all. Great to see you. Wish you well for the holidays and see you next year.
Yeah,
Take
happy
care.
holidays.
Yeah.
Right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.